Reid's mornings began with the same metallic clang of the alarm, a jarring punctuation to the quiet hum of his small apartment. He'd rise, always at 6:15, and perform the ritual: coffee, a quick scan of the financial news, and then the meticulously pressed shirt and tie. His work in data analytics was a world of clean lines and predictable patterns, a comfort he'd built for himself after years of drifting. He valued order above all else, a bulwark against the inherent chaos he sensed simmering beneath the surface of everyday life. He was a man of routines, a determined anchor in a predictable tide. Then came the letter. It arrived nestled amongst bills and junk mail, an anomaly with its thick, cream-colored paper and an unfamiliar return address from a solicitor in a town he'd never heard of. The weight of it in his hand felt heavier than paper should. Inside, the formal script informed him of the passing of a distant relative, a man named Elias Thorne, and a subsequent inheritance, a property. An isolated cabin, deep within a forgotten forest, somewhere far from the city grid he knew so well. Reid read the letter twice, a frown creasing his brow. Elias Thorne. The name barely registered, a whisper from a childhood he'd mostly compartmentalized. He remembered a faint, unsettling story, something about a hermit, a recluse, but the details were fragmented, lost to time and disinterest. The cabin, the letter stated, was the last remnant of Thorne's estate. No other beneficiaries. No other claims. Just Reid, a name plucked from a forgotten branch of a family tree. A strange pull began to assert itself, a quiet insistence that nudged at his carefully constructed calm. He wasn't sentimental, but the sheer unexpectedness of it, the abrupt severance from his ordered world, stirred a dormant curiosity. He found himself researching the area, a remote corner of the country where the roads thinned into gravel paths and the forest stretched for miles, unbroken and ancient. The map showed few landmarks, just vast green swaths and contour lines. He decided to go. It wasn't a rash decision. He weighed the pros and cons, the cost of travel, the disruption to his schedule. But the determination that usually drove his analytical pursuits now channeled itself into this unexpected detour. He needed to see it, to understand why he, of all people, had been chosen. The journey was long, a slow unraveling of civilization. The multi-lane highways gave way to two-lane roads, then to narrow, winding paths barely wide enough for his car. The air grew cooler, heavier with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The incessant drone of traffic faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of unseen birds. He felt the city peeling away from him like an old skin, exposing something raw and unfamiliar beneath. Hours passed, the sun dipping lower, casting long, distorted shadows through the dense canopy. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a perpetual twilight even in the late afternoon. He checked the faded, hand-drawn map provided by the solicitor, tracing the last leg of his route. It indicated a singular point of reference, an old weather station. He found it eventually, nestled off a barely discernible track that branched off the main gravel road. It was a squat, concrete structure, its whitewashed walls stained with mildew and age. A rusted anemometer spun slowly on a tall mast, a lonely sentinel against a sky now bruised purple and gray. A faint, almost imperceptible humming emanated from within its closed doors, a low thrum that seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath his tires. It felt less like a scientific outpost and more like a forgotten monument, a place where the world ended and something else began. Reid parked, killed the engine, and the sudden silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that pressed in on him. The hum from the weather station was still there, a ghost in the stillness, a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to sink into his bones. He looked at the station, then back at the track leading deeper into the woods, the one marked as the path to the cabin. It was barely more than an animal trail, overgrown with ferns and moss. The forest wasn't merely quiet, it felt attentive. The trees seemed to lean in, their ancient forms observing his presence. The air itself felt thick, charged with an unspoken expectation. He was no longer just visiting a property, he was stepping into something old, something that had been waiting. He got back into the car, his movements deliberate, forcing down the unease that threatened to ripple through his methodical mind. He drove slowly, the car bumping over roots and rocks, the branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. The light dimmed further, the forest swallowing the last vestiges of twilight. And then, through a gap in the gnarled branches, he saw it. The cabin. It sat low to the ground, as if hunkering down, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from under a heavy brow of eaves. No smoke, no light. Reid pulled the car to a halt, the engine sighing. He stared at the structure, a strange mix of apprehension and a determined resolve hardening within him. This was it. The inheritance. He had arrived. But the air around the cabin felt heavy, not just with the weight of years, but with something else entirely, something that hummed with the same low, resonant frequency he'd felt at the weather station, only here, it was amplified, a silent roar. And he had only himself to blame for walking into the fragments. Reid had packed his life into a few boxes, leaving behind the precise geometry of his apartment for the wild, untamed curves of the forest. The drive had been long, the final miles a winding track of gravel and packed earth, swallowed by a canopy so dense it felt like driving into the belly of something vast and ancient. He'd passed a rusted sign, barely legible, pointing towards a weather station further up a forgotten spur road, a lonely sentinel of technology in this primeval expanse. The cabin itself was a hulking silhouette against the setting sun when he'd first arrived, smelling of damp earth and generations of dust. Its windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from under heavy eaves. Inside, the air was thick, carrying the scent of cedar and something else, something vaguely metallic, like old coins or dried blood. He'd spent the first few days simply trying to impose order. Unpacking his few books, arranging his clothes in the heavy, insect-chewed dresser, wiping down surfaces gritty with fine, pervasive grime. He'd even tried to set up a rudimentary workspace, his laptop a beacon of modernity on a scarred pine table. One evening, as the last sliver of twilight bled from the sky, Reid was wrestling with a stubborn window latch, trying to let in some cooler air. A faint scratching sound began, rhythmic and soft, from within the wall beside him. He paused, his hand still on the latch. Mice, he thought, a natural assumption in such an old, secluded structure. He waited, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. He was in the woods now, not his hermetically sealed apartment. Nature was going to make its presence known. Later that night, curled in a sleeping bag on the floor, the bed upstairs felt too daunting, too much a part of the cabin's history. He was jolted awake by a sharp thud from the floor above. It wasn't the creak of settling wood, which he'd already grown accustomed to, but a distinct impact, heavy and resonant. His eyes snapped open in the pitch black. The cabin was utterly silent now, the forest outside holding its breath. He lay there, rigid, listening to the frantic beat of his own pulse against the pillow. "Old house," he muttered into the darkness, the words feeling thin and unconvincing even to his own ears. Just the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still, heavy. He eventually drifted back to a fitful sleep, the sound lingering at the edge of his consciousness. The next morning, the sun streamed through the front window, painting stripes across the dusty floorboards. Reid, determined to banish the lingering unease, set about preparing breakfast. As he reached for the cast-iron skillet hanging above the stove, he noticed something. The small, tarnished silver locket, which he'd found tucked into a drawer and placed on the mantelpiece the day before, was gone. He frowned, scanning the mantel, then the surrounding shelves. He was meticulous, he knew exactly where he'd put it. He bent down, checking the floor. Nothing. A prickle of irritation joined the fading echoes of last night's dread. Had he moved it without thinking? He often did, lost in thought. He mentally retraced his steps, his logical mind searching for an explanation. Perhaps it had fallen. But the mantel was deep, the floor clear. He shrugged, dismissing it as a momentary lapse. He'd find it later. Days turned into a week. The disturbances, though minor, began to accumulate. He was a man of data, of observable facts, and these were nothing but ambiguous sensations. Yet, each dismissal felt a little less firm, a little more forced. A seed of doubt, tiny and sharp, had begun to germinate in the fertile ground of his solitude. He decided to tackle the attic, hoping to find some old tools or perhaps a better lamp. The narrow, rickety stairs groaned under his weight. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light filtering through a grimy window. The air up here was even thicker, laced with the scent of dry rot and forgotten things. Boxes, draped in cobwebs, were stacked haphazardly against the sloped walls. He began sifting through them, uncovering moth-eaten blankets, cracked ceramic dishes, and a collection of strangely carved wooden figurines. Deep in a trunk, beneath a pile of brittle lace, his fingers brushed against something hard and leathery. It felt impossibly heavy in his hands. The leather was cool against his skin, despite the stuffy attic air. He wiped away the dust with his sleeve, revealing a series of symbols embossed on the cover, intricate and unsettling, like ancient, thorny vines. He tried to decipher them, but they were alien to anything he knew. He carefully opened the journal. The pages were yellowed, brittle, covered in a cramped, looping script that was difficult to read. It wasn't English. It looked like some archaic form of a European language, perhaps German or an Old Norse dialect. He squinted at the first few lines, his data analyst's mind already trying to break down the unfamiliar characters, to find a pattern, a key. It wasn't just old, it felt charged. And for the first time, a tangible object, not just a fleeting sensation, anchored the strange occurrences to something more than his own imagination. The seed of doubt blossomed into a tendril of genuine unease, wrapping itself around his determined heart. Reid had packed his life into a few boxes, leaving behind the precise geometry of his apartment for the wild, untamed curves of this forgotten place. Yet, the tranquility of the forest morning was a brittle veneer, easily shattered. He woke to a persistent, faint scratching sound, not from outside, but from within the walls. It was irregular, hesitant, like tiny claws dragging over dry wood. He told himself it was just a squirrel, perhaps a mouse, but the sound seemed to shift, moving from the wall beside his bed to the ceiling directly above him. A shiver, unrelated to the morning chill, traced a path down his spine. The air in the room, already cool, seemed to drop several degrees, making his breath mist faintly. He pulled the rough wool blanket tighter, listening until the scratching faded into the general creaking of the old structure. The following days brought a slow, insidious unraveling of his composure. The scratching returned, often accompanied by a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the floorboards, too deep for any animal. Objects began to subtly rearrange themselves. He'd leave a book on the bedside table, only to find it on the floor, open to a random page, its spine cracked. The old tin cup he used for coffee would migrate from the counter to the sink, even though he distinctly remembered rinsing it and leaving it to dry. Each incident, isolated, could be dismissed as forgetfulness, the quirks of an old house settling, or his own mind playing tricks. But the cumulative effect chipped away at his rational defenses. Then came the smells. It was visceral, unsettling, and undeniable. He started checking for leaks, for dead animals in the walls, but found nothing. One evening, as twilight bled through the grimy windows, painting the cabin's interior in shades of bruised purple and gray, Reid watched a shadow detach itself from the corner of the fireplace. It was too fluid, too tall to be cast by any object in the room. It stretched, elongated, then seemed to fold back into itself, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He gripped the arms of the worn armchair, his knuckles white. His breath hitched in his throat. This was no trick of the light, no settling house. This was something else. He could no longer rationalize. He needed answers. His distant relative, the one whose death had brought him here, had left no explanation, only the cabin and its growing malevolence. Reid began his research in the cabin itself. He scoured every dusty shelf, every forgotten drawer. He found stacks of yellowed letters tied with brittle twine, the cursive faded beyond legibility. He unearthed old almanacs, their pages brittle, filled with annotations about weather patterns and planting cycles. Deep in a cedar chest, under layers of moth-eaten linens, he found a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was blank, its pages thin and fragile. The script inside was tight, meticulous, belonging to an ancestor, perhaps the relative who had built the cabin generations ago. Most entries were mundane records of daily life, harvests, repairs, the harshness of the seasons. But interspersed among them were increasingly frantic passages. Words like the hunger, the bargain, and the price appeared with alarming frequency. One entry, dated over a century ago, spoke of the land's claim and the blood's due. There was a crude, unsettling sketch beside it, a swirling vortex of lines, resembling both roots and grasping fingers, with a single, unblinking eye at its center. The journal offered glimpses, not explanations. For more concrete information, he would have to venture out. The nearest semblance of a settlement was little more than a scattering of cabins and a general store miles down a winding, unpaved road. The map indicated it was old, perhaps abandoned, but it was the only place marked with a distinctive, almost ritualistic symbol, identical to the one in the journal. The drive was long, the road narrowing to a barely discernible track swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. When he finally arrived, the weather station was exactly as he'd imagined, a squat, utilitarian building of corrugated metal and weathered wood, surrounded by a tangle of rusted antennae and forgotten instruments. The door creaked open at his touch, revealing a single, large room filled with dated charts, dusty consoles, and the low hum of ancient machinery. An elderly observer, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, sat hunched over a flickering screen, seemingly oblivious to Reid's entrance. "Excuse me," Reid said, his voice echoing in the quiet space. The observer slowly turned, his eyes, pale and sharp, fixed on Reid. "Lost?" he rasped, his voice like dry leaves. "No, not exactly. I'm Reid. I've inherited the old cabin on the ridge. I'm trying to find out more about its history, about the land." He held up the journal, pointing to the symbol. "Do you know anything about this? Or about the cabin's past?" The observer's gaze flickered to the symbol, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He rose slowly, his movements stiff. "The cabin," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It was built on ground that was claimed long before your people came. Long before even the first trees here were saplings." He moved to a large, wooden cabinet filled with rolled-up maps. He pulled one out, unfurling it on a long table. It was ancient, hand-drawn on parchment, detailing the local topography with surprising accuracy. "And sometimes, the land remembers." He pointed to a section of the map where the cabin stood. There, etched in faded ink, was the swirling vortex symbol, larger and more intricate than the one in the journal. Below it, in tiny script, were two words, "the lineage." It wasn't just a cabin he'd inherited, it was a legacy. A debt. And the land, it seemed, was finally ready to collect. The air in the cabin had grown heavy, thick with unspoken accusations. Reid felt its weight press against his skin, a cold, insistent presence that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. The previous night's revelation had stripped away any lingering doubt. This wasn't just a property, it was a burden, a legacy of something ancient and hungry. He started his search methodically, beginning in the main living area. His fingers traced the rough grain of the wooden walls, the cold, smooth surface of the fireplace stones. He pushed aside the threadbare rug near the hearth, revealing nothing but splintered planks. He ran his hand along the mantelpiece, feeling for loose bricks, but found only dust and the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke. He'd noticed it before, a slight draft, even when the windows were sealed tight. He pulled the heavy shelf away from the wall, scraping wood against wood with a groan that echoed through the silent room. Behind it, the wall planks seemed to fit together more snugly, almost too perfectly. He pressed against them, tapped, listened. One section gave a duller thud than the rest. With renewed determination, he found the faint outline of a seam, expertly hidden. His fingers, trembling slightly, probed along it, searching for a latch or a release. Eventually, near the floor, he felt a small, almost imperceptible indent. He pressed. His breath hitched. This was it. This felt significant. He pulled it out, placing it carefully on the floor. The lid was secured with a tarnished brass clasp. He unlatched it, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Inside, resting on a bed of brittle, yellowed cloth, was a single, leather-bound journal. Its pages were thick, handmade, and filled with faded, spidery script. The first entries were mundane, detailing weather patterns, crops, and family events, dating back over a century. But gradually, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew more frantic, the descriptions more unsettling. The bargain demands its due. Elias spoke of a pact made in desperation, for abundance in barren times. He detailed rituals, not of worship. Of appeasement, sacrifices of livestock, then small offerings of blood, to sate the hunger of the earth. The journal entries became increasingly paranoid, hinting at a terrible truth that Elias was trying to avoid putting into words. He mentioned a cycle, a harvest, and a caretaker role passed down through the generations. But the crucial details, the true nature of the pact, what exactly was being harvested, and how it related to his lineage remained agonizingly vague. Then, a specific entry caught Reid's eye. Elias wrote of a record keeper, a man who lived near the old weather station, who meticulously charted the Earth's temperament and celestial alignments in relation to the cabin's strange phenomena. Elias had sought him out, hoping for an explanation, or perhaps a way to break the cycle. It comes for me now. The station. The weather station. He knew his recently deceased relative, the one who'd owned the cabin, had a strange fascination with the old, abandoned weather station a few miles deeper into the forest. He'd dismissed it as an eccentricity, but now, driven by a desperate urgency, Reid placed the journal back in its box, securing the hidden compartment. The weather station was a dilapidated structure of peeling paint and rusted corrugated metal, perched on a small, exposed ridge. It looked like a forgotten sentinel, battered by countless storms. The front door hung ajar, groaning faintly in the breeze. A faint, metallic tang hung in the air, mingled with the damp earth and decaying wood. Inside, the single room was a jumble of antiquated equipment, a rusted anemometer, a broken barometer, charts yellowed with age tacked to the walls. Dust lay thick on every surface. He moved through the debris, his eyes scanning for anything that resembled a hidden compartment or a personal effects. In a corner, beneath a collapsed shelving unit, he found a sturdy, steel filing cabinet. It was locked, but the drawer was slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. He pried it open with a grunt, the metal protesting with a shriek. Inside, among old reports and meteorological data, was another journal. This one was newer, its leather cover still supple, and the handwriting familiar. It was his recently deceased relative's. The missing pieces. The entries began years ago, mirroring Elias's initial observations, but quickly delving deeper. His relative had clearly found Elias's journal, or something similar. The script grew increasingly frantic, the ink pressed hard into the pages. He wrote of the ancient entity that sleeps beneath the soil, awakened by the pact of our ancestors. He detailed the specifics of the bargain, generations of prosperity in exchange for a tithe of life, a harvest of spirit, to sustain the entity when its hunger stirs. The entity, he wrote, was not some external force. An intrinsic part of the land itself, a primal consciousness that had been dormant until the pact. It demanded a sacrifice every few generations, a member of the bloodline, to renew its power and ensure the land's continued bounty for the remaining family. The caretaker was simply the one chosen to be consumed. The final entries were terrifying in their resignation. "It is my turn," his relative had scrawled, the words barely legible, smeared as if by a trembling hand. "The land calls. It is collecting the debt. There is no escape for a caretaker. No escape for the bloodline." He wasn't just an heir, he was the next sacrifice. The entity wasn't just tied to the land, it was the land, and it was waiting. He was trapped, bound by a pact made by his ancestors, and the horror had finally come for him. The understanding from the night before, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, had not dulled with the dawn. If anything, it had sharpened, digging deeper into Reid's marrow. He wasn't just trapped, he was bound. Every beam, every floorboard seemed to hum with an unseen energy, a low, thrumming pulse that resonated in his own chest. He rose, the floorboards groaning under his weight as if in protest. The air, usually crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, now carried a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or rusted iron. He moved through the small living space, his gaze scanning the familiar objects that now seemed subtly alien. A thin layer of dust, finer than any he'd seen before, coated the surfaces, shimmering faintly in the weak light, like powdered bone. He pulled out his satellite phone. He tried the charging cable, fiddled with the battery. Nothing. He'd charged it fully just yesterday. He tried the old landline, a relic he'd discovered tucked away. Dead. Utterly, irrevocably dead. The nearest point of potential contact, the weather station, sat a few miles deeper into the forest, a small, isolated outpost of human endeavor. He knew the winding, overgrown path to it, having explored it briefly days earlier. He threw on a jacket, the rough wool feeling like a comfort against the growing unease. The birdsong, usually a riot of sound, was muted, distant, as if the forest itself held its breath. The path, once merely overgrown, now seemed to actively resist him. Branches reached out, snagging his clothes. Roots, thick as python coils, snaked across his way, tripping hazards that appeared from nowhere. He pushed on, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the metallic tang from the cabin now seeming to cling to the very air he breathed. Finally, through a curtain of ancient pines, he saw it, the squat, gray structure of the weather station, its antenna a skeletal finger against the bruised sky. He burst through the rusted gate, the screech of its hinges echoing through the unnaturally quiet clearing. The main door of the station stood ajar, flapping gently in a non-existent breeze. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and ozone. The main console, a jumble of blinking lights and crackling screens, seemed to be powered on. Hope, fragile but potent, surged through him. He fumbled with the dials, tuning to an emergency frequency he knew the local rangers sometimes monitored. Reid. Is anyone out there? I need assistance. Static answered him, a wall of white noise. He tried again, louder this time. Repeat, this is Reid. Emergency. I need help. Then, a voice. Not the crisp, professional tone he'd hoped for, but distorted, tinny, barely recognizable. Reid? Is that you? What's going on? It was the colleague he sometimes collaborated with, a fellow researcher, a voice from the normal world. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. Yes. It's me. I'm at the old weather station. I need to get out of here. Something a shriek, sudden and guttural, tore through the radio, cutting him off mid-sentence. It wasn't human. It was a sound of rending metal and tearing flesh, amplified, twisted, utterly inhuman. It's here. The entity wasn't confined to the cabin. His connection, his only lifeline, had been severed, and worse, used to send a message. He dropped the radio. It clattered to the floor, sending sparks flying as it shorted out. A low groan reverberated through the weather station, not from the radio, but from the very structure itself. He stumbled backwards, his heart hammering against his ribs. He yanked at the door, but it was stuck fast. He threw his shoulder against it, again and again, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. Not just in the cabin, but in the entire forest, in this cursed lineage. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a hungry maw, and he, Reid, was the next meal. He was trapped, bound by an ancient, malevolent will, and it had just demonstrated its reach. It knew his connections. It would use them against him. He was truly, utterly alone, and the hunt had begun. The radio clattered to the floorboards, its sudden silence more jarring than the shriek that had preceded it. His colleague's voice, ragged and torn, still echoed in the small space, a raw testament to an agony Reid couldn't comprehend. What kind of sound was that? Not human, no. Something ancient, something that tore not just flesh, but metal. He snatched the keys from the hook beside the door, his movements jerky, uncoordinated. There was no time for analysis, no room for logic. The weather station, that was the plan. His colleague had been heading there, checking the remote sensors, promising to call in from its more robust comms system. It was the nearest point of contact, the only hope for answers, or for help. He burst from the cabin, the crisp night air doing little to clear the fog of dread clinging to his mind. He fumbled with the key, his hand shaking so violently he missed the ignition twice. Finally, the cold metal slid home. He twisted. A click. A whine, weak and distant, like a dying animal. Then, nothing. He tried again and again, pumping the gas pedal uselessly. The engine remained stubbornly silent, a dead weight of steel and wire. Frustration, hot and bitter, surged through him, threatening to boil over. It wasn't just dead, it felt inert, as if the very life had been sucked from its mechanical heart. This wasn't a simple battery issue, this felt deliberate. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the glove compartment. If the Jeep wouldn't go, he would walk. The weather station couldn't be more than a few miles, a rough hike, but manageable. He'd done it before. Stepping onto the leaf-strewn path, the beam of his flashlight cut a wavering swath through the impenetrable blackness. The trees pressed in, their branches weaving a skeletal canopy overhead, blotting out the already faint starlight. He pushed forward, adrenaline coursing through him, urging him onward. The path, usually a distinct track worn by deer and the occasional hiker, felt different tonight. The undergrowth seemed thicker, the roots more aggressive, tripping his feet. He kept his focus fixed on the faint impression of the trail, trying to ignore the subtle shifts in the peripheral gloom. Then, the sounds began. Not distinct, not immediate, but a tapestry woven into the forest's natural symphony. A low, persistent hum, just at the edge of hearing, like a colossal insect. It wasn't a language he knew, but the implication of sound, the suggestion of a presence. He thought he saw it then, a flicker of light, an artificial glow through the dense trees. Hope surged, a desperate, irrational burst of warmth in his chest. He pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes, ignoring the stinging scratches on his arms, driven by the image of that light. He broke through the last line of trees, gasping, only to find himself not at the weather station, but standing before a colossal, ancient oak, its bark gnarled and twisted like petrified rope. And impaled upon one of its lower, thicker branches, was the antenna of a portable radio. It was his colleague's. He recognized the model, but it wasn't merely stuck. The metal was fused, partially absorbed into the living wood, as if the tree itself had swallowed it, digesting the technology. The shriek. This wasn't just a monster in the cabin, it was the forest. The entire landscape was a living, breathing, malevolent entity, an extension of the thing that claimed his family's legacy. It hadn't just stopped the Jeep, it had taken his colleague, absorbing him into its ancient, hungry core. He stumbled back, his mind reeling, the world tilting on its axis. The hum grew louder, pulsing now, vibrating through the soles of his boots. He could almost discern words, ancient, guttural sounds that clawed at the edges of his comprehension, promising unspeakable things. Panic, raw and visceral, seized him. He ran until his muscles seized, until his breath became ragged, tearing gasps. When he pushed himself up, disoriented, his flashlight beam wavering, he saw it. The cabin. He had circled back. The forest had played him, hurting him, like a shepherd with a lost lamb. He hadn't escaped. He had merely completed a horrifying, inescapable loop. His sanity, already fraying, felt like a thread stretched taut, vibrating on the brink of snapping. Not now. Not ever. Reid's breath still hitched in his chest, the metallic tang of fear a persistent aftertaste. The radio lay on the cabin floorboards, a dead thing, its sudden silence more jarring than the raw shriek that had preceded it. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that staying put was no longer an option. The cabin was a trap, closing in, and the entity, whatever it was tightening its grip. A small, hand-drawn circle marked a weather station deep in the forest, several miles from the cabin. It was a long shot, but perhaps it held some forgotten records, a different perspective, or simply a place where the air felt less tainted. Any port in this gathering storm. The forest, once merely dense, now felt actively hostile. Trees loomed, their branches like skeletal fingers scraping at the bruised sky. He dared not look back, convinced something immense and unseen was tracking his every move, a predator playing with its prey. Finally, a break in the canopy revealed a clearing, and there it stood, the weather station. It was a ramshackle structure of corrugated iron and splintered wood, leaning precariously as if poised to collapse. The paint, once a dull green, had long since peeled away in great flakes, revealing rusted metal beneath. A tall, skeletal mast, stripped of its anemometer and wind vane, clawed at the gray sky, groaning softly in the breeze. He pushed open the warped door, which groaned like a dying beast. The single room was cluttered with forgotten instruments, a corroded barometer, its needle frozen in place, a disemboweled radio receiver, wires spilling like entrails, and a table heaped with mildewed logbooks. His gaze fell upon an open journal, its leather cover cracked and flaking. The ink on the exposed page was faded, but the script, meticulously penned, was still legible. It was a different hand than the previous owner's, older, more deliberate. He picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. The entries were dated almost a century ago. August 14, 1923. The land demands its due. The pact holds, barely. The harvest was lean this season. The forest grows restless. The guardian stirs. Reid frowned, flipping through more pages. The language was archaic, veiled, but a pattern emerged. Entries repeatedly mentioned the pact, the guardian, and the harvest. Then, a specific entry caught his eye, underlined multiple times, October 3, 1923. The family refuses the blood. Foolish. They do not comprehend the bargain. The land will take what is owed. It hungers. The eldest son, a strapping youth, vanished from his bed last night. A fitting offering, though not willingly given. It wasn't folklore. It was history. He turned another page. A series of crude drawings followed, stick figures arranged in a circle around a swirling vortex, hands outstretched. Beneath it, a scrawled note: the bloodline feeds the root. The roots feed the land. The land protects the bloodline. A cycle. A promise. Broken, it consumes. Reid felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. The true nature. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, or a demon. It was a primal, territorial hunger, an ancient entity tied to the very earth beneath the cabin, sustained by a pact. His ancestors had made a bargain: protection and prosperity in exchange for sustenance. A regular harvest from their own bloodline. The guardian wasn't protecting them from something, it was protecting itself and demanding its due from them. He flipped to the very last page, where the ink was fresher, though still aged, perhaps from the distant relative who had owned the cabin. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. May 12th, year illegible, but recent. It calls for me. The pact has been neglected too long. The last offering was insufficient. It wants more. It wants a true sacrifice. The blood runs thin, but it remembers the promise. It will take what it is owed, and more. The lineage must pay. The journal clattered from Reid's numb fingers, hitting the dusty floor with a soft thud. The last offering was insufficient. And his death, sudden and mysterious, was not enough. The entity was not appeased. It was still hungry. And now, Reid was the last remaining branch of that cursed lineage. The true sacrifice it demanded. A wave of nausea washed over him, bile rising in his throat. He wasn't just inheriting a cabin, he was inheriting a death sentence. The entity wasn't just twisting reality, it was demanding his life, his very essence, to fulfill an ancient, monstrous bargain. The land was reclaiming its due, and he was the final payment. He was the harvest. A low, vibrating hum, far deeper than any wind, began to resonate from the floorboards, climbing up his legs, seizing his bones. The skeletal mast outside groaned louder, a sound like a tortured spirit. He was trapped. The full, terrifying scope of his inheritance, the sacrifice required, slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. There was no escape. Only the payment. The journal clattered from Reid's numb fingers, hitting the dusty floor with a soft thud. The last offering was insufficient. The words carved into his mind, cold and sharp. And his death, sudden and mysterious, was not enough. The entity was not appeased. A fresh wave of terror, colder than any he'd felt before, washed over Reid. He was next. The cabin was a trap, a slow-acting maw. But beneath the ice of fear, a spark ignited. A fury, bright and hot, against the unseen thing that had stolen his family, that twisted the very air around him. He wouldn't be another link in this chain of misery. He wouldn't be another offering. He would break it. He snatched the journal from the floor, his fingers trembling but firm. There had to be an answer. Cryptic notes, half-finished sentences, faded sketches of symbols he hadn't understood before. One passage, scrawled in a shaky hand near the end, spoke of the true observations kept where the sky is measured. It was followed by a crude, almost forgotten sketch of what looked like an old, derelict structure. The weather station. Reid remembered seeing it on an ancient, hand-drawn map tucked into the cabin's oldest atlas, a tiny, isolated dot deep in the woods, far off the main path. He'd dismissed it as an abandoned curiosity. Now, it felt like the only hope. The air had grown heavy, thick with a scent like damp earth and ancient iron. The cabin itself seemed to hold its breath, watching him. He grabbed a flashlight, the beam weak against the encroaching gloom. The path, barely a deer trail, was choked with gnarled roots and slick moss. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, was amplified, sharpened into a threat. Reid pushed through low-hanging branches that clawed at his jacket, their skeletal fingers seeming to reach for him. The ground beneath his feet was soft with generations of fallen needles and decaying leaves, muffling his steps, making him feel utterly alone. After what felt like an eternity, the trees thinned slightly, revealing a clearing. The weather station. It was a squat, two-story building, its windows long shattered, gaping like vacant eyes. Reid's flashlight beam cut through the interior. Broken instruments lay scattered across the floor, their dials shattered, their needles bent. He moved cautiously, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. There was no obvious sign of anything useful. He remembered the journal's phrase, "true observations." Not just weather data, but something else. He ran his hands along the rough-hewn walls, feeling for loose panels, hidden compartments. His fingers brushed against a section of wall that felt slightly different, smoother, less aged than the surrounding timber. He pressed, pushed, pulled. Inside, nestled amongst desiccated spiderwebs, lay not another journal, but a heavy, tarnished brass plate, etched with symbols that mirrored those in his ancestor's journal, but with crucial additions. And beside it, a smaller, thin ledger, its cover made of hardened leather, bound with wire. This wasn't a log of observations, it was a testament. Reid pulled them out, his hands shaking with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The ledger's brittle pages crumbled slightly as he opened it. The script inside was meticulous, flowing, and far older than anything in the cabin journal. It detailed not an appeasement, but a binding. A pact made generations ago, not to gain power or protection, but to contain something ancient and malevolent beneath the land. The offerings weren't to feed it, but to reinforce the seal, a continuous input of life energy to keep the entity from breaking free. His distant relative's death had been insufficient because it was merely a single, desperate reinforcement, not a true understanding of the complex binding. The entity wasn't trying to consume him in the traditional sense, but to exhaust the lineage, to weaken the generational link that maintained the seal, until it could fully breach the containment. The brass plate, the ledger explained, was a key. It depicted the counter-ritual, the means to unravel the binding entirely, to sever the connection between the entity and the land, freeing the lineage from its cursed duty. It required a specific chant, precise placement of the plate, and a symbolic act of severing at the cabin's heart. The risk was immense. If he failed, the entity would be unleashed, utterly free. Reid clutched the plate and the ledger, his mind reeling. He had to return to the cabin. Now. The journey back was a blur of heightened senses. He burst through the door, the old wood groaning in protest. The air inside was thick, almost viscous, with a palpable malevolence. The floorboards beneath his feet felt soft, spongy, as if the very wood was rotting from within. A low hum vibrated through the room, a sound just below the threshold of hearing, but felt deep in his bones. He had the knowledge, the key. The ledger specified a precise location, the hearth, where the cabin's original fire had always burned. The heart of the home, now the nexus of its curse. The hum intensified, vibrating through the very stones. The air around him shimmered, distorting the simple wooden furniture into grotesque, elongated shapes. You cannot break what is bound. You are ours. Just another link. Reid ignored them, his gaze fixed on the hearth. He consulted the ledger, his fingers tracing the ancient script. He began to chant the words from the ledger, his voice hoarse but firm, the unfamiliar syllables feeling strange and powerful on his tongue. As the chant began, the cabin reacted violently. The hum surged into a roar, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing his chest, stealing his breath. Objects flew from shelves, shattering against the walls. The very timbers of the cabin shrieked, groaning as if under an unbearable strain. Reid fought through the onslaught, his eyes watering from the pressure, his body screaming in protest. He could feel the entity's rage, its desperation. He kept chanting, his voice rising, a defiant challenge against the ancient horror. He reached for the final, symbolic act described in the ledger, to take a piece of the cabin's oldest wood, a piece that had witnessed the original pact, and sever it with an iron blade, a ritualistic breaking of the connection. He saw flashes of impossible light, colors that didn't exist, twisting his vision. His mind screamed for him to stop, to give in, to save himself. But Reid pushed through, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the splinter of wood. With a grunt of effort, he brought the knife down, severing the connection. A searing crack echoed through the cabin, not just of wood, but of something far deeper, something ancient and terrible. The roar stopped. The screams died. Reid stood, gasping, the knife still in his hand, the severed splinter on the hearth. He had done it. He had broken the pact. The entity was no longer bound. And Reid had no idea what that truly meant. His voice, raw and strained, cracked on the final syllable. The air in the cabin, already thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, grew impossibly heavy. The brass plate, nestled in the cold ashes, began to hum, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into Reid's teeth. The symbols etched into its surface pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, mirroring the frantic glow of his flashlight beam. The cabin convulsed. Not a tremor, but a violent, wrenching spasm that tore at its ancient timbers. A shriek, not from a living throat but from the very fabric of reality, ripped through the small space, a sound that flayed the inside of Reid's skull. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the noise was internal, a cacophony of breaking glass and splintering bone echoing in his mind. Dust rained from the ceiling, mingling with larger chunks of plaster and decaying wood. The hearthstones groaned, and a deep fissure spiderwebbed across the mantelpiece. Reid held his ground, his gaze locked on the glowing plate. He saw flashes, brief, terrifying glimpses of contorted faces, limbs twisting into unnatural angles, eyes like shards of obsidian reflecting a primordial void. These weren't memories, they were impressions, forced into his mind, an attempt to break him, to drive him mad with fear. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The green light on the brass plate guttered, then vanished, leaving only the dull gleam of the metal in the flashlight's weak circle. The violent shaking ceased. Even the dust motes seemed to hang motionless in the air. The cabin stood, scarred and wounded, but no longer vibrating with malevolent energy. Reid collapsed, his knees giving out beneath him. He didn't fall entirely, catching himself on the edge of the hearth, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His muscles screamed in protest, every joint aching. He felt as if he had run a marathon while simultaneously being crushed under a great weight. He lay on the cold floorboards, listening to the frantic thumping of his own heart, the only sound in the unnaturally quiet cabin. His head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache behind his eyes. He reached up, his fingers touching a sticky warmth at his temple. When he pulled his hand away, it was stained crimson. A thin trickle of blood had run down his cheek, congealing near his jawline. It wasn't a deep wound, but a testament to the internal pressure he'd endured. More than the physical toll, there was a profound emptiness within him. It wasn't relief, not entirely. He felt lighter, but not in a good way. As if a part of him, a vital piece, had been ripped out and consumed. His memories felt hazy around the edges, like old photographs faded by sunlight. He struggled to recall the faces of people he knew, the details of his life before this cabin. They were there, somewhere, but distant, muted. The cost, he realized, was not just the blood on his temple, but a subtle, insidious erosion of his very self. He pushed himself up, his limbs stiff and protesting. The cabin was a wreck. Books lay scattered, their pages torn. A small table was overturned, its ceramic lamp shattered. Yet, the hearth, despite the new fissure in the mantel, remained largely intact. The brass plate still lay there, dull and inert, a silent witness. Driven by a desperate need for air that didn't taste of fear, Reid stumbled out of the cabin. It was too quiet. He walked, not sure where he was going, only that he needed distance, space to breathe, to think. He walked for what felt like hours, the moon a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, until he saw it, the silhouette of a small, dilapidated structure rising above the treetops. The weather station. He remembered seeing it on an old, faded map he'd found in the cabin's attic, a relic from a time when someone, perhaps a forebear, had attempted to monitor the elements in this forgotten corner of the world. The station was a single-room shack, its windows long since broken, its wooden walls weathered to a pale gray. A rusted anemometer, frozen in place, pointed uselessly at the sky. A few pieces of ancient, unidentifiable equipment lay scattered on a workbench, covered in cobwebs. Reid slumped against a wall, his eyes scanning the desolate interior. He needed a moment, a sliver of peace, before returning to the cabin. His gaze fell upon a small, metal box tucked away under the workbench, almost hidden by a pile of rotting papers. It was a sturdy, military-style container, surprisingly clean. He pulled it out, his fingers fumbling with the latch. It clicked open. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, was a single, meticulously preserved item, a small, tarnished silver locket. It was unlike anything else in the cabin, too delicate, too personal. He opened it. Instead of portraits, two miniature, intricate symbols were etched into the inner surfaces, one he recognized from the ledger, the other a twisted, thorny vine he'd seen only in the most disturbing of his visions. Beneath the locket, a single, folded piece of parchment lay. It was not ancient, but written in a firm, elegant hand, the ink faded but legible. It was a message, dated nearly a century ago, signed simply by the Guardian. The pact holds, but the cost is ever shifting. It demands balance. One cannot simply banish what has been given form. It will always find a new vessel, a new anchor. The lineage is not merely to contain, it is to transform. You, Reid, have broken the cycle of containment. You have become the new nexus. The cabin is free, yes, but its hunger has merely found a new host. Look within. The true horror has just begun. Reid reread the words, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The emptiness inside him, the hazy memories, the subtle shift in his perception, it wasn't just trauma. It was a transformation. He wasn't free. He was the next link. The entity wasn't gone. It was within him. The cabin was quiet, yes, but the storm had only just found its new eye. The cabin's silence was a shroud, heavier than any physical weight. Reid reread the final scrawled lines, the ink seeming to pulse faintly on the aged parchment. He was the next link. The words were not a revelation of a past event, but a prophecy already fulfilled. The emptiness he'd felt, a void where his memories of the ordeal should have been, wasn't merely trauma's aftermath. It was a space hollowed out, ready for occupancy. And now, it was no longer empty. It wasn't a hostile invasion, not anymore. But these weren't external observations, they were sensations that resonated within him, as if his own nervous system had expanded to encompass the very structure, the very ground. He stood for a long time in the center of the main room, the dust motes dancing in the meager sunlight that pierced the grimy window panes. His hands, he noticed, were steady. His breathing was even. There was no frantic pulse, no surge of adrenaline. The fear hadn't vanished, it had transformed, becoming a fundamental part of his new, altered state. He wasn't free. That much was brutally clear. The entity hadn't been banished, it had merely relocated, finding a more permanent, more intimate vessel. He was the culmination of the pact, the next inheritor of a legacy he had desperately tried to dismantle. The horror hadn't ended, it had simply begun a new chapter, with him as its unwilling, yet inextricably bound, protagonist. A strange compulsion nudged him. He needed to leave the cabin, not to escape it, but to carry it forth. Each item felt foreign in his grip, as if his hands were no longer entirely his own. The walk from the cabin was different this time. He didn't look back. There was no need. The cabin, in essence, was coming with him. His destination was vague, a desperate, illogical pull towards the nearest semblance of civilization, however remote. The old logging trail eventually met a narrow, unpaved road. He followed it, the sun a pale, distant orb above the dense tree line. Hours bled into one another. His body moved with an unfamiliar resilience, his mind a quiet echo chamber where the entity's presence was a low, resonant thrum. He found himself noticing details he never would have before, the precise angle of a raven's flight, the pattern of moss on a particular stone, the subtle tremor of the earth underfoot. Dusk was painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges when he finally saw it, a squat, utilitarian building perched on a low rise, its dish antenna a skeletal finger reaching towards the heavens. The weather station. A beacon of the mundane world, yet utterly isolated, just like him. He pushed open the heavy metal door, the sound echoing in the small, sterile room. A man, thin and bespectacled, looked up from a console, his face etched with surprise. "Well, I'll be," the attendant mumbled, adjusting his glasses. "Haven't seen a soul up here in weeks." "You lost?" Reid felt a smile stretch his lips, a strange, unfamiliar sensation. Perhaps it was Reid's disheveled appearance, the wildness of his hair, or the unblinking intensity in his stare. The air in the small room, so sterile moments before, now felt charged, subtly different, as if a quiet storm had just entered. He asked for directions, for a way out of the deeper wilderness, towards any town, any road that led away. The attendant, clearly unsettled, stammered out instructions, his eyes darting away from Reid's. Reid listened, but his awareness was split. He heard the attendant's words, yet simultaneously felt the faint, distant thrum of the cabin, miles behind him, still connected, still calling. Leaving the weather station, Reid walked back into the deepening twilight. The world felt porous now, the boundaries between what was real and what was perceived blurring at the edges. He was no longer just Reid, the man who had inherited a cabin. He was something more, something less. He was a keeper of a terrible secret, a vessel for an ancient power, irrevocably bound to a lineage of sacrifice. The horror hadn't been vanquished. It had merely been redefined, transformed, and had taken up residence within him, a silent, ever-present companion. The victory, if it could be called that, was a bitter one, leaving him not free, but profoundly, terrifyingly, aware.